Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to the third day of this year's Humanitarian Congress. My name is Anja Osterhaus. I work as Program Director for Oxfam Germany, and I want to thank the organizers for giving us the opportunity to support the organization of this Congress now for the third year in a row. Thank you also for giving me the opportunity to welcoming all of you to this very important day of the Congress with three topical issues on the agenda. The first panel today will address the question of localization and power. How can we come to an equal relationship? How can we finally move from charity to transformative justice? We have been talking about this for many years. We have our own commitments since at least 2016, and we have not been able to move from commitment to action. So today's conversation will hopefully move us a little bit more into the right direction. The second issue today will be feminist pathways to a climate-just future. The climate crisis, as we all know, is already there, and it is hitting particularly the most vulnerable people in countries that are least prepared to address the shocks of climate, at the same time have not contributed very much to it, or even very little to it. So how can we look at this from a feminist perspective? How can we support particularly women and vulnerable people in addressing the problems arising from the climate crisis? The third panel will look at the global food crisis. So is there anything that at the moment concerns us as humanitarian actors more than the global food crisis? We know that over 800 million people across the world are affected, and almost half of them face acute food insecurity. These are developments that are absolutely dramatic and concern us all, and they are rooted in a global food system which is full of injustices. So to look at the root causes of this hunger crisis will be the topic of the third panel today. I wish you all a very inspiring day with lots of food for thought, with interesting discussions, and with some new ideas about how to move us forward in humanitarian action. Thank you.
Welcome to your first panel on localization and power. My name is Isadora Key, and I am joined by some fantastic speakers today who are going to help us get to the heart of this matter. We're going to look at what perspectives a feminist approach can offer and how we can find some new ways to find a more equal relationship. Our special speakers today include Mi-Xun Wu from the Asia Pacific Forum on Women, Law and Development. Mi-Xun, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Isadora. My name is Mi-Xun from Asia Pacific Forum on Women, Law and Development. In short, it's APWLD. We are a feminist membership-driven network in Asia and the Pacific. We believe in the power of the feminist movement and solidarity with other people's movements. And we have over 260 members from 30 different countries and territories across Asia and the Pacific.
Mi-Xun, thank you very, very much. I'd also like to welcome Muzna Dorit to introduce herself as well. Muzna.
Hi, everyone. Happy to see you all. And my name is Muzna Dorit. I'm from Syria. I work as a senior program development officer for the White Helmets, which is like a local humanitarian organization in Syria, where we provide like a search and rescue and health aid for civilians and for IDPs in IDP camps in Syria. And we are also Alternative Nobel Peace Prize winner back in 2017. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Muzna. And our third wonderful panelist is Gabrielle Kohler. Gabriella.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here as well. I am a board member of Women Engaged for a Common Future, which is an NGO that works at the intersection of gender justice, climate justice, women, and gender health. We are in many, many countries on the ground, helping cooperatives, for example, to install renewable energy implements such as solar panels. And we're working at the EU level, trying to influence the European Union's policies on gender, on climate issues, on mobility, on energy issues. And then we're also active at the multilateral level of the United Nations, working on the SDGs. Some of our members were quite influential, if I may say so, in shaping the text of the 2030 agenda from a gender justice perspective. Thank you.
We are grateful and blessed to have you with us. Thank you so much. We know people are calling in from all over the world. Si vous êtes francophone, nous avons en fait la traduction. Il faut aller sélectionner l'interprétation des petits mondes qui est en bas pour écouter la session en français. So that was for our French speakers. If you would like live captioning, that is possible too. So if you would like us, just click on it and you'll be able to see live captioning in English. We want to make the session as accessible as possible to people wherever you are. Of course, if you have questions, we want to hear from you as well. It is not possible to share questions on the live stream feature. So if you do have questions to ask and ideas that you want to share, please join us on the Zoom link and share your questions. The questions are moderated and will be filtered through to us. So thank you very much for that. Let's get started and right into the session today. We're really going to talk about some of the things that are at the heart of localization, really. What does it really mean to localize? And we're going to talk about some things that are perhaps uncomfortable to talk about too. We're going to talk about money. We're going to talk about power. We're going to talk about control and decision making. The things that really need to move and change for localization to become more of a reality, to move from being policy to practice. Today's conversation is going to be framed a little bit through a process at CARE we call Women Lead in Emergencies, which is one of the tools we use to make sure that we're moving money and decision-making to the most local level. It's a 5-step process, so we're going to be starting with some reflection, some analysis, some feminist co-creation, action, and learning. So my first question to all panelists is really, what are your reflections on gender and power? What do you think about this unequal relationship that we find in the localization space? And how do you live it? What do you think about it? Gabriela.
Let me maybe look at this multilateral level of the United Nations. And so we have this process that I'm sure everyone here is aware of, the Agenda 2030 with those 17 SDGs and with a reporting process at an annual meeting called this High-Level Political Forum. And the overarching title of the agenda is Transforming Our World. And I think my first point is that this transformation, this notion, this concept of transformation has been hijacked by the powerful. Everyone's talking about transformation, even dictatorship countries, even the highest income groups. Isidora, you were talking, or in the introductory video, rather, there was about, the people most affected are the least responsible, for instance, in the climate change, but also to do with gender injustices. But we, in the agenda text and in the high-level political forum, the whole notion of class is omitted. So when we talk as gender feminists, gender aware, gender transformative, perhaps feminists, as climate activists, even we, when we talk about intersectionality, don't really talk about class enough. The economic class, which actually gives the power to governments, people in the governments, people in societies, people in local communities. And this class blindness, I think, hampers a lot of our action, because we work in environments, be it at the multilateral level, be it at the local level, where we talk about gender justice, but we don't really see that gender justice is also layered. And so the issue of power or lack of access to power is not sufficiently, I would say, discussed. The notion of transformation is hijacked. And then the whole issue of this hierarchy in countries and hierarchies at the UN level, of which countries report, how much time, how many resources, financial resources, and political resources are put into that reporting process, as one of many examples, is very different depending on a country's situation. And then we have this whole camouflaging of issues in the discussions at the UN, that the UN, because it's so powerless, has become so powerless, doesn't actually talk about. One example on that point, when the countries do their voluntary national reviews of their SDG performance, North Korea can report, just like Germany. All countries report, and all the UN Secretariat does is compile the messages of the countries. There's no commentary. There's not saying Germany actually omitted information on income inequality and wealth inequality that's growing. There's no commentary on the fact that North Korea is violating basically the most basic SDGs, including the one on the right to democracy. Let me maybe hear, let's listen to what the other colleagues have to say.
Thank you, Gabriela. Musna, how does this feel to you? I know when we talked about it, you were like, I just have so much to say on this. What does it mean to you?
Yeah, so we are often like now we are hearing the term localization and partnership and gender and power, which is a trend right now. But like we have like to seize this moment and like to think about it. Are we have like the real like implication of the localization and gender and power nexus. So and if these like taking in place in the humanitarian sector specifically. So for me, as a person with the lived experience of displacement, and also as a worker in a humanitarian level at the local level from a grassroots organization, partnership and localization started from decolonization and meaningful equal partnership. And this is what doesn't mean. This is like that power should be backed by meaningful budgeting, because like we can't just like expect like a change from just words without actions that backed also with funding and money to push for these agendas. So because like money is power, so we can't ignore like this fact. And we have also a good example about like money and power. For example, Russia at the Security Council is blocking the aid delivery to Syria through the cross-border mechanism. And despite like this funding and this money, it comes from Western countries, it comes from the UN system, but they are using the power of veto at the Security Council to block the delivery, the aid delivery for displaced people in Northwest Syria, despite it's like only a basket of food. So this is what doesn't mean power. It's money, but also the right of veto or like the power, the political power, and so on. So we can't ignore one of them. And also, we need to ask ourselves at like individual level, at like international level, who are at the table, and are all of us equal at the table? We have similar like a position, and all of us will be heard. And also to have this like a self-reflection on our to address like our biased decisions. It's like why we choose this organization to deliver aid and how, and all these questions. Like it just like I want also to flag that number don't lie. And so just like to remind ourselves about funding and power and localization. So the State of Humanitarian System 2022 report, which is the first report, is looking for at like a sector-wide finance during COVID pandemic, found that like out of 39 billion US aid in humanitarian funding in 2020, out of this 39 billion, only 1.8 went to local and national organizations. So 98.2% went to large international organization, despite the fact that local organization did the large majority of COVID-19 response work around the world, not only in Global South. So we need to ask ourselves how, who have the money and to what extent it's accessible for others. And now when it comes to gender, we are also less privileged, despite that we are, as a woman in the humanitarian sector, we deliver the work, and we, our society also rely on our care economy because it's unpaid economy. So this has to change, and we have to delegate the power and money together to women to lead the humanitarian workforce by passing the seat to new feminist leadership. We spend like our time just like to convince like member states and also international community about like why and how we should have like feminist and also localization approach. But I think this is the time to move for actions, because like it's obvious for all of us why it's added value to have women at the table as like to lead the change, and also specifically women from Global South and specifically women with lived experience, because they are the closest for the problem and they know very well how to address these problems and the crises.
Thank you, Muzna. Mizun, I know that you have very rightly questioned the whole localization agenda. Why do we need to localize when the action is actually already local? And what ideas can collective response actually give as well? So Mizun, what are your thoughts on this topic?
Yeah, thank you, Isadora. And also just to build on from what Gabrielle and Musna just mentioned, I had a problem with the word localization. Like, what do we localize when our problems are so structural? And most of the time it is colonial and imperialist, right? And as Musna just mentioned about the veto power within the UN Security Council, UN is made not really in a democratic way. Majority of the countries in Asia and the Pacific region even didn't have independence from the colonial power at that time, right? So, and as we all know, once the situation Ukraine happened and Syria happened, for instance, the ongoing situation in Burma, Myanmar disappeared from the agenda because it doesn't serve the superpowers' political and economic interests anymore. But at the same time, the ongoing collaboration behind the scene is continuing, isn't it? So that's why, what do we localize? Do we localize those not really meaningful or target that is set at the global level that is not structural? Or is it really time for us to scrap the localization? Of course, there are things that needs to be localized, including the human rights principles and standards, but it really is a time for us to reshape the discourse to recognize and be led by grassroots ownership and leadership, right? So, and we have been hearing a lot, especially on women's human rights and gender equality, the word empowerment, right? It's not about political rights anymore. It is about political empowerment. It is not economic right or justice, it's economic empowerment, whatever, right? But then do we really see the power in there in the hands of women? Or is simply just shifting the language to actually pinkwash the feminist and women's agenda, right? So what we really want to see and needs to see or aim is to create a shift in power relationship and structures. And that's what we mean by transformative change. And to be more specific, through the new and the post-2015 agenda has been happening, we have worked a lot and very hardly to really address the very issues of inequalities of power, wealth, and opportunities between countries and between rich and poor and between men and women. And that's what we are going to do. And to do so, we believe that we have to build the capacity of women to organize women and analyze what are the systems and structures that put women in the current reality that is violent, unjust, unequal, and unsustainable, and so that women and their communities are able to take collective actions that are not only meaningful to them, but generate the social change that will also liberate other marginalized constituents in our society.
Thank you, everyone. Mizun, can we continue your analysis, actually? I know when we analyze gender and power, it can be quite complex to bring in some of those structural elements, but it really is the start in some ways, in addition to that consciousness raising, those reflections that we can have about gender and power and localization, and you're right to question it. That analysis is that second stage of like, well, okay, we're now aware. How do we analyze the current situation? So how do you analyze the current situation? How do you work with your members? What does it mean to you when you look at it from a structural point of view?
So as I just briefly mentioned, APWLD, we are a feminist and membership-driven network. And our members are very, very diverse, right? And includes different communities, including rural, indigenous, urban, poor, women with disabilities, migrant women, women workers, and LGBTIQ group, and so forth. And we also believe in the intersectionality of our feminist and women's movement. So that's what we try to make constant efforts to share power and challenge the power dynamics within our own organizations and movements. And we know it is not easy or comfortable because it requires us to acknowledge not only our privilege, but to actually let it go, because that's the beginning of sharing the power, right? And our membership-driven network nature of it, it means that the process for us to make a decision or put the political positions, it takes long time. Sometimes it's a hardcore debate because we are very diverse. We are not just one women group, right? So, and then we come from different contexts, whether it's political, social, or economic. So, but once we have the position analysis, that is non-negotiable, right? So what we do is we name the systems of oppressions that is interconnected, which are patriarchy, of course, but that intersects with different fundamentalisms, neoliberal globalization, and militarism, right? But what we also try to do is that we build our own capacity to analyze our situations using that PGFM framework. We name it as PGFM framework. And then we also collectively articulate then what is the solutions, what are the visions, because we don't want to just critique, right? So for that, for us, that is women's human rights and development justice, which talks about redistributive justice, economic justice, social and gender justice, environmental justice, and accountability to the people, because the states are delegating their whatever obligations they have to the corporations and letting the corporate take up the power while they're not protecting the human rights of their own people. So maybe I'll just stop here.
No, that analysis and that framework you use is really interesting, and I'm sure people will want to know more about that. Gabriela, you work at both the very global level and you've also spent a lot of time working at the very local level. What is it about your analysis and your collective analysis of the situation that leads you to work in those two different, very different spaces? How do you analyze power and gender?
Well, I completely agree with Misan on the analysis, sort of an eco-feminist critique of hyperglobalization, of hypercapitalism. One issue, I think, at the multilateral, at the global level, is the disconnect between different agendas. So I mentioned we all referred to the SDG talking about, transformation. To me, an extremely important process at the moment that has a lot of implications directly and indirectly for gender and for climate justice is about a binding treaty on business and human rights. Because if we had such a binding regulation of how transnational companies operate, violating labor rights, violating human rights, gender rights, climate justice, biodiversity, if we had a global regulatory framework to which countries exceed and really, bind themselves, we would have a very different starting point in this globally structural disadvantage for all of us who are in a weak position. So that connect is not there. We should be connecting at the UN level these different discussions, equally the plastics convention that's under discussion and the many conventions and ILO convention, human rights conventions and ILO conventions that are in place. I would completely agree with Misan on the need for this structural analysis, and I think we agree on the points. I disagree a bit on the point about localization, because I think the power dynamics also play out there. We as we women engaged for a common future as an example, being based in two European countries, is at a location where one can mobilize resources for these different projects in countries. And so just by virtue of having that privilege of being closer to donors, German donors, Dutch donors, EU donors, etc., has power. That puts power, and it puts a hierarchy into the relationship with the communities with whom WECF, as an example, is working on the ground, because the donor, the NGO that raises the funds is then accountable to the donor and then transmits the donor's requirements to the localized work. may not be d'accord with what the requirements are on reporting, on spending, and on transparency, on who's included, but has to has this middle point. I'm not saying, I'm not excusing WTF. I'm just saying that's a challenge. And how does one balance out this power that's just built into the financial resources, and empowered, but not empowered in the hijacked sense, but really place power and decision-making autonomy on the communities that are working with money raised in the global north. And the same applies, actually, just to backtrack quickly on the SDG negotiations. And Misan and I are both in these networks that try to influence the discussions, and we have those 2 minutes time to contradict what governments are saying about how they're performing on the SDGs. So it takes so much time to compact into that 2-minute speaking time what are the main priority issues. And there again, there's power play in terms of who has the time to negotiate the 2-minute text, who has the resources to be able to be in that particular process. So I think power plays out both at the capitalism level, at the global level, but it also plays out even in our very feminist structures inadvertently. We don't want it to be like that, but that's just the daily practice.
Yeah, power isn't necessarily bad, right? There's different kinds of powers. There's the power to, there's collective power as well. It's not always power over and power to oppress. No,
but I do mean the power over in these two examples. Yeah.
Got it. Mizun and Muzna, I'm coming to you in just a second to ask about the power analysis that you do. But Mizun, there's a question in the chat to ask a little bit more about your PGFM framework. So could you remind people about what that is?
Oh, I see. So the P stands for patriarchy. So we analyze how different forms of patriarchy is actually oppressing women and violating women's human rights and women's bodily autonomy. And patriarchy has many different phases, right? It's not just patriarchy itself. So the other one that other interconnected structure framework that we name is neoliberal globalization, or as Gabrielle named it out, is capitalism, right? Because how the capitalism promotes the individualistic approach and capital over people's rights, and then how it defines not only economic policies, but also social, cultural, and political power dynamics. And actually what we are seeing in the entire development world, it is the power of the capital and the capitalist policies and structures. And we analyze how it affects women, is including our labor rights. And Musna mentioned the women's care labor, right, which is not recognized. And also many of the women are working in informal sectors without any recognition as women workers, right? So that's an example how the patriarchy interacts with the capitalist idea and structures and systems. And fundamentalism, it is different forms of fundamentalism that we talk about, where the dominant power uses the identity to pursue the power and then retain the power structure by othering the others, right? So it could include religious fundamentalism. It could have a phase of nationalistic approach and so forth. And the last is militarism. And we know that the military power and militarization has been used a lot. Also, we see a lot more conflicts over resources, and we also see how the militarism fuels the climate crisis and also the trade order to maximize the capitalist profit. So yeah, I hope that explains a bit more.
Thank you, Mizun. That's really helpful. Musna, how do you analyze gender and power and resource flows from where you sit?
Yeah, so let me just back to my point, which is money or funding doesn't stand alone from power. And power is, it doesn't mean only just to have a voice or to have a space to speak out, but also it's the process, how you have been selected and how where's we're women at the table. So our approach as a grassroots organization in Syria is not only about delivering humanitarian aid and delivering like our work, but also to speak out about like the root causes of which include like injustice and also accountability for this injustice. And this is like it comes from our bottom-up approach as a refugee and as a IDP-led organization. And here, let me also stress that it's always we hear it's like, yeah, local and grassroots organization, they don't they don't have like the capabilities to deliver aid, or they don't have a structure, or they don't have the institutional design. I'm sorry, there's a lot of examples. It's like our also our like a annual budget, it's like a multi-million budget we have, and also we have the capabilities and offices outside of Syria, inside in Europe and North America. So this is a grassroots organization beyond borders, and we always need to put an efforts to find a way to include local organization to be at the table. So coming back to our approach for gender equality, it's like we believe on also in democracy as a key principle for humanitarian work, which is like it's like also to use elections from beneficiaries and from targeted group and people in need to choose like who will be delivering aid for them. And this is like we always like the system is dealing with the beneficiaries as like a passive recipients of aid, but like our approach is like, no, we have elections, so and memberships for people in need, and they vote for leaders from their areas and leaders also from their camps to represent them, and also to also vote on behalf of them to the like a higher election in our institutional design. And this is also, it comes to our board members, which is like a working board member. And it's like, because of, and here's not to promote for Canada, I'm a Canadian Syrian citizen, but also I'd just like to mention it's really what helped us to achieve gender equality in our institutional design, which is Canada's feminist policy, foreign policy, which has helped us also to analyze, it's like where is women, and also what power women have in our institutional design. So we dedicate like a new seat. So we started at the White Helmets with the 1% of women's participation in our team as a team members, and we ended up now with a 30% women's participation at all levels, which is like board members, as a team members, as also like team members on the ground and high management. So it comes to the role of donors and how they could stress on like the analysis of the institutional design of a grassroots organization, and also international organizations. It's just like to ask ourselves about like how, to what extent this design it's exclusive and also feminist in a way to allow women to have like a leadership in the humanitarian work. Also, just like I have another example about I worked for Indigenous people in Canada, and one of the work in financing system, Indigenous people are trying to push also for it's like the grassroots organization and also local organizations should like choose like from who they will like receive aid rather than the opposite. It's like our system is like, now there's the donors, there's sometimes also in like a call for fundraising, like a private call for funding, but Indigenous people, they believe also that it's like we as a grassroots organization have the right to also choose like who will like fund us, because we are also delivering this work in a proper way, and also in a way to be like meaningful and to address also the root causes. It's not only the impact of the crises, but also to have permanent solution for the crises that we have all over the world. So this is like and like now also we have in Canada also international development feminist policy, which is also what I heard, like Germany also joined Canada last G7 meeting in May, back in May, early June. So we have this like a movement, a new movement to question our humanitarian work, and also from a feminist perspective, and also to keep asking ourselves how we can improve our work and making it more feminist, more inclusive, and more accessible also for all people from different backgrounds and from different capabilities as well.
Thank you, Ms. There's some great questions coming in the chat. We will come to those. I want to Mizun, you talked a little bit about just how long it takes to make decisions in a networked approach where you have very diverse, not members with very different points of view. Given that we're all in many ways part of this system, we live in this system as well as wanting to change the system. And I'm curious to know more about how decision making changes when you take that feminist collectivist approach. So Mizun, could you tell us a little bit more about how you make decisions as a collective?
So well, to be why am I mumbling? APWLD, okay. Always I think we're in a constant reflection, and because we are diverse and there are different kind of power that each one of us hold. And the Asia and the Pacific, even the Pacific is one large continent, Asia and the Pacific are comprised of 5 sub-regions, right? And then our membership itself are not equally representable of those 5 sub-regions, right? So as APWLD, as a membership network, we also know that our membership is smaller. So the voices could be smaller coming from Central Asia or East Asia compared to Southeast Asia or South Asia, right? But what unites us is that we have a shared political analysis, right? That is the biggest one, right? And the PGFM and our vision, that is to achieve women's human rights and development justice. Having said that, to be a truly feminist and membership-driven network, we have to make our structure also reflective of that, right? So we don't only have a governance structure, but different programs have a structure where the members can drive our work, right? So I would just give you a recent example of how our new strategy for 2022 and 2026 happened. So it was happening in the COVID context when we couldn't travel, and all of our members have a chance to meet every 3 years at our General Assembly. And General Assembly is the space where we make a strategy as APWLD, right? But with the COVID, it wasn't going to happen. So what we did, even though we were half doubting ourselves because our members are grassroots, don't really have internet access or technology or even devices, right? So we are half doubting, but we were determined we have to do it. So we did have 5 sub-regional convenings. To our surprise, those sub-regional convenings and General Assembly had so much of a participation, not only for a few hours, all 3 days for each sub-regional convenings, where the realities of women are shared, right? And where the analysis were done in a collective manner. When there is issues that is difficult to understand, we try to unpack it. When there are some new emerging issues that our members are not really aware of, then we identify who are the ones we should work together. Right? So that through that process, which took us about 6 months, because that also have been added. When we have a draft, then there are also program members coming to contribute to that, to shape it again, right? And then we represent it to our membership, and that's how we come with our strategy, right? So the membership driven and really participatory, it is not an easy piece, but without that, we don't need to exist. What do we do? Because where are the issues coming from? So that's the very nature of it. And that's when I mentioned that I challenged the word of localization. It has to be the other way around. It has to come from the ground, informing the global structure in the system and the standard. So yeah.
Mizun, thank you for that. That must be quite the process navigating, and it's interesting to hear more about it. Musna, you talked about the push factor actually of a global donor like Canada with its global feminist foreign policy. Netherlands has got it now. Germany's just announced it as being like a push perhaps for the white helmets to think more about gender inclusion and going from that 1% to 33% of women's inclusion. How was a decision like that made within the white helmets? Was it purely coming from a donor push, or was it also something the white helmets themselves, you as a collective, decided that you wanted to work on? How did you decide to do it?
Actually, both, like, and also because like even when we had this like will to change like our institutional design, but we had like a lack of funding because, you know, as like a grassroots organization, we have always, and like we work in Syria, which is like a active conflict country, we have always like the crisis, it's like really increased, and also there's the needs on the ground, it's really increasing over years. So this is why changing policies and changing like bylaws and institutional design, it's also costly, and it needs also like a investment in time, energy, and also funding. So, and that comes also when Canada also helped us like to achieve this institutional design and to make it more like feminist and more like accessible for women, and to change it from scratch. So this is also, it comes also for the scale of funding, where we are always like looking for like, I mean, the system itself, it's always like focusing on just like delivering funding for like to deliver programs, but we are not often thinking about like for long-term impact. It's like how we can help local organizations to change their institutional work and like design, and also the power dynamics of their system. So and so the funding, it comes like as like in alignment with Canada's foreign feminist policy, and also it's like that every single like a program and funding should be like dedicated like to not only engaging women, but also to support them to have like leadership position in the organization, and also how we deliver aid in a way to help also beneficiaries and targeted group from the local community, like to support women and to change. Because like Syria, as like any country it's like in a global south, it's patriarchal society. It's like we have also a lot of like armed groups, it's like, and also the government, we have like our military government that also like a booming civilians in Syria, and also the laws in Syria, it's also against women in terms of like passing citizenship, in terms of inheritance, in terms of also protection. So we have a lot of problems, and like we need to tackle all of them in the same time. So this is why we can't like advance humanitarian work without advancing also system structural, and also to change the institutional design itself as a civil society, but also like as a member states, donors, and we should be in the same page at like all levels. So this is how it comes. It's like we always have a lot of like we have will to change so many things. We have a lot of like, you know, like goals to achieve, but unfortunately, because like the work during emergencies, it's so hard. We have like bombs that like rain down from the sky, and also we have COVID on the ground, and now we have cholera in Syria. So a lot of accumulating crises like back to back. So this is why when we have a dedicated funding to change like the institutional design, it helps a lot, like not only the white helmets, but also all like local organization and the local community itself.
Thank you, Muzna. Gabriela, Women in Europe for a Common Future is a really complex organization created from after the Earth Summit in Rio back in 1992. You've got 150 members. Is it similar to what Mizan was reflecting in terms of like quite complex decision-making processes? How do you make a decision on what to do?
I think there's a lot of parallels that one has the consultations, for instance, on the, I think it's a 3-year program that we have, and how does one define the priorities. So, consulting everyone who's actually in the network, all the different groups in the network. But I must say, I was very impressed by how Misan said 3-day consultations in all these places. I'm afraid we're not that ambitious. That's really admirable. But if I may, Isadora, I'd like to, because we're talking about power, and also my big concern is about this co-optation of progressive terms. And I really have stomach aches with this notion of feminist foreign policy, because the countries, I'm not going to talk about Canada, not my country, Germany is my country. Germany is now saying we're having feminist foreign policy. The trade policy of Germany for the past decades has been to the detriment of the global economy and of poor people and poor women and other people in the informal economy for decades. We have a horrible macroeconomic policy that's into austerity, and it's resuming, going back. Well, there's a fight now, but there's probably going to be back to austerity. Germany is not promoting debt cancellation. We have, I think it's 17 or 18 countries that are in severe debt distress. Germany is blocking getting debt distress, get debt cancellation, or at least, an extension, or at least special drawing rights. Climate policy, Germany is going very, very slow. As a country, we're a major emitter of CO2, and we're going much too slowly on actually getting out of that. So there's all the real policies happening that are to the detriment of gender justice because of the austerity, for instance, or the employment policies, global employment, exploitative labor in global production chains. We're going against, or very slow on climate, we as a country, not me personally. And then one says, oh, we're doing feminist foreign policy, or we're doing feminist development cooperation policy. I think what is nice about the new development cooperation policy is to be more gender responsive, and that definitely, I think there is a genuine effort to do that. One could say the same for foreign policy, that if one is trying to put a gender lens to what what German foreign policy is doing, but it is not feminist, and it is certainly not eco-feminist. And I really hate this capturing of our terminology, because that means trying to capture our agendas for social justice and climate justice and gender justice. So as you can see, it gets me really riled up. Yeah,
we love the passion, and Mizu and Alia talked about pink washing. So
exactly.
People often accuse feminists from the other perspective of having so much discussion, being really passionate about the issues, but perhaps that we don't take enough action. And I think that there's actually, as Musna said earlier, there's really a huge amount of humanitarian feminist actions that are actually being taken. So as we go towards the close of this session, I really want to ask you a little bit about some of the feminist humanitarian actions that you are actually taking to challenge that narrative that all we do is talk and critique and maybe protest, which are all really valid things, but we also take a lot of we take action to improve the material conditions that people are facing and the women are facing around the world. So could I invite everyone to give me an example of some of the actions that people have been taking to deal with some of the humanitarian crises that are facing people right now? Musna, obviously this is the bread and butter of what the White Helmets do, but could you tell us one of the things that you're doing that is that speaks to this?
Personally or collectively?
As you wish.
Personally, it's just like I'm trying to pass the space for new also feminist activists from Syria, from Yemen, from Afghanistan, from Iran, from all active conflict countries. So because it's so hard for women and for feminist activists to have access to high level meetings, to know about new funding opportunities and so on. So personally, I'm trying to spread the word and also to share my seat to new feminist leader. Collectively, we have also ambition about to have a more than 30% of women's participation in our team. It's hard because also, as I said, it's like we need funding to achieve also feminist shift, but also not only funding, but also the knowledge sharing from other contexts. So we are trying also to share knowledge with the grassroots organization in Ukraine to have this power change and also knowledge change between us in terms of how we can improve women's role in and enabling women to have their space and to lead the humanitarian work, and also with other similar contexts. But we have similarities with the Ukraine because Russia is booming both countries, Syria and Ukraine. So there's a multiple level of steps, but overall sharing my seat and also knowledge sharing with other organization, and we keep our also target. We set the bar very high, and also we keep on mind that it's we need to ask for not only funding, but also help and experience from all organization and the grassroots to achieve that.
Thank you, Mizna. Mizan, the APWLD took some very specific humanitarian actions during COVID. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Isadora, actually, to be really honest, when I first got the invitation to this humanitarian assembly, I was a bit doubting, is it the right place for APWLD? Because we are not a humanitarian group, right? But then, we have something to say and share. So yeah, that's why I'm here today. But then, the humanitarian crises are a consequence of structural issues, right? Whether it's war or climate crisis or a health crisis whatsoever, right? While the response to the humanitarian crisis forced not to be structural or systemic. Even the definition of humanitarian aid says it's for short-term urgent support, right? But then what we experienced through the COVID-19 pandemic, as we hear from our members and their communities on the realities of women, is that resources, whatever that is, development aid, whatever you name them, are very strictly categorized, divisive, and pigeonholed, right? So for instance, development aid is not supposed to be used to address the urgent needs of the communities. But that was the reality, that it's because of the structural issue and as a consequences of that, right? So what did we do? We first of all created space to hear from our members of their realities on the ground, what's going on, what is the needs of the women in their communities, what can be helpful, right? And we had to be creative, while we also had a very good and strong funders who allowed us to program our work to provide direct support, right? Including the personal protection equipment or food or blanket and so forth. And through that, what we continue to do is organizing of women. And by collectively organizing, women gain political power, right? So what that result from our members and partners, I would give you a few examples. Their advocacy actually led to over 2,400 sex workers in India to access free COVID vaccinations. Similarly, internal migrants in Nepal who don't have a citizenship card because the internal migrants have a complicated situation, they also got free access to COVID vaccination. And women were starting community kitchen and community farm. And that's how they build the sustainability of the community. So the question again is this crisis humanitarian alone, or deeply developmental injustice due to inequalities of power, wealth, and opportunities between men, between rich and women, and between rich and poor, and between the countries?
And Mizan, would you feel comfortable with saying it's both? It's both the humanitarian reality and the structural issues. Does that feel fair?
It is both, but the cause is structural. Humanitarian crisis is a result of that, right?
Absolutely. Thank you. Gabriela, action, humanitarian action. What humanitarian actions are coming? Oh, please.
Well, just to say, I completely agree with Mizan on this point that the COVID crisis as one, there was always this discourse that was deepening the crisis. It revealed the structural inequities because all the people who were badly affected were already poorly affected by the economic structures, by climate impact, climate change impact, etc. WECF at the local level, yes, there were some individual instances of support, but I think I can say, hopefully I'm correct, that we tended to stay in the development mode, if we want to make that distinction. What WECF contributed to at the global level is the discussions ongoing at the Women's Major Group, one of the contributors to the SDG processes, of actually critiquing global macroeconomic policy, the whole structural environment that creates the injustices and inequities. And at the European level, we've been publishing work criticizing the European Green Deal, which is portrayed as gender just and climate just, and which we are showing in our analyses, which are structural analyses, that many of these policies are gender blind. They're not deliberately gender unjust, I wouldn't go so far, but they're gender blind. And at the same time, promote climate injustice because they're very nationalistic at the EU level, just looking at how can the EU save itself without looking at the impact, the footprint, the global footprint of the EU countries as a whole. But I'm very impressed by the examples that both Musna and Misun are giving of your action on the ground.
And what I loved about those examples, thank you, Gabriela, was that sense of collective decision-making and advocacy, and then action, and that reinforcing nature, that analysis, collective decision-making, and then action it reinforced women's legitimacy and power as well. Like that's a more equal relationship, perhaps. Go ahead.
Just 1 second on geopolitics, something that we forget, that there are so many connections between these global wars that are happening. And just to remind that before Ukraine was invaded, Ukraine was actually one of the major weapons supplier to the junta in Myanmar. And, so there's all these now Russia continues to be a main supplier of weapons to the junta, but there are all these geopolitical connections that we tend to not always be aware of.
Thank you, Gabriela. I did not know that. We have a few minutes before we close our session and some fantastic questions. So I don't want to ignore the voices of those listening in, and I want to share some of those with our panel. Perhaps we can take a question each. Gabriela, this is a question for you. And really, I'm going to need a 30-second answer. I'm sorry on that. It's a long question too. Isn't it the responsibility of international actors to challenge the donors and their rules and regulations, more advocating to shift powers and to maybe adjust some of the rules and regulations that block lots of local actors from accessing more direct funding? And what should the role of intermediaries change, and what could it become? So you probably pick only one part of that to answer in 30 seconds.
Definitely, that would be the role. I mean, one example I'd like to give from both from NGO and from UN work, that local staff from the country are paid significantly less than the international staff who don't necessarily have more expertise. And that is something that we could change. So in purchasing power parity, it should be the same salary for everyone in an institution. And that's something that we could maybe raise as an issue for gender justice and for social justice and economic justice.
Thank you, Gabriela. Mizun, this is a tricky question. There is no easy answer to it. How do you reconcile working with funding from states which are the product of colonialism and in many cases perpetrated colonialism with feminist and decolonial principles? And how do you lean in to be even more accountable to participant communities instead of aid agencies in such situations?
Yeah, that's exactly what we're trying to dismantle as much as possible. And also we realize that, there are also different kind of power inequalities, even among the global South women, right? Because of neo-colonialism, if I may say it, right? So Africa might have a seat because of the EU giving a seat for Africa. Latin America might have a seat because the North America is giving something, right? Asia and the Pacific forever marginalized because we are colonized by different colonial power, right? So yeah, again, the resource is colonial, right? And then we have been hearing the strategy is often designed by the capital, not engaging the people. That's how the feminist foreign policies, feminist trade policy all came about because we cannot talk about feminism or name something feminist unless there is a shift of power, right? So one country cannot have a feminist foreign policy unless actually their policy is designed by the women from the countries that they have a development policy, right? Because that's how the development agenda will be dismantled and be reshaped by the people who are oppressed, right? So that's what we are actually trying to do. But the only way for us to do so is to build a collective feminist movement. But again, with the solidarity with other social justice movement and diverse feminist movements.
Thank you, Mizan. Thank you so much. Muzna, a question for you. How did you handle colleagues having completely different views on the topics and connecting people in power and resistors that feminism is the way forward?
Yeah, briefly, change takes time, and yeah, we have to keep trying and pushing for change, and also, yeah, it takes time, but we need to continue our work, regardless of the if we're gonna say it as a generation or for future generations. So we have to keep working and change things as much as we can.
Thank you, Muzna. We are coming into our final minutes together. Thank you so much for joining us. We hope that we have begun to start unpacking what some of this unequal relationship might look like and how power, money, resources, feminism, and other intersectional issues come into play. I'd like to invite our panelists to share some final thoughts about what they're learning about this topic. Who would like to go first? Gabriela, please.
We need to connect the dots, I think, between the different areas where ecofeminism will make a change, and we need to connect the dots at the multilateral level and, of course, at the bilateral and country level between different agendas. Yeah.
Muzna.
We have also justice and accountability. It's not only to pointing out like what's like and flagging the problems, but also we have to have like accountability mechanism for all like injustice that we have and inequalities that we have in our system.
Thank you. Mizun.
Isadora, I'm really sorry. When you're asking the question, you're breaking up, so I didn't get your question.
My question was, what would be your final thoughts and reflections on this topic to share with those listening in?
Sorry. And I think maybe the key question that I want to put to ourselves is that how do we continue as humanitarian and development, right? Because the line is getting blur and much more closely connected because the crises are most time system-made, right? So, and we know that the transitioning between humanitarian development isn't a linear process. So maybe more collaboration really between the two groups, there will be more to address the structural issues would be great.
I always think about feminist power as being one of those things where we think about ourselves as a network or a spider's web where we're at our strongest, we're unbreakable when we're connecting in different ways and kind of breaking out of the boxes that we've been put into to kind of find new ways to collaborate, work together, and to challenge ourselves always about what we can do differently. This unequal relationship has to change. We need to make sure that power, money, and decision-making sits at the level of those most affected by crisis. We need to make that happen, and we need to hold states and governments accountable to that too, and ourselves as well. Thank you so much to our panelists, and thank you to everyone in the chat who has really expressed their thanks to the panelists as well. They're thanking you for some amazing, inspirational and critical points raised. They appreciate a lot this session. So thank you very, very much for joining us today, and thank you so much to our panelists for all of their speeches. Thank you and goodbye.
And thank you to Isadora.
Goodbye.
Pleasure.